Hi everyone and welcome back to Neuropsych. So in the last video we went over an introduction to memory, we went over what memory encoding is, memory retrieval, and we talked about different kinds of memory. Specifically, we went a little bit deeper into explicit memory. We also talked about the hippocampus, the subparts of the hippocampus, and the two rhinal cortices, the entorhinal and the perirhinal cortex. So in this video, we are going to go over the next part of the three long-term memory systems, which is implicit memory. And then we're going to talk about the last one, which is emotional memory. Okay, so let's start off with implicit memory. So implicit memory is our memory for learned skills, conditioned reactions, and short-term events. It is non-conscious and it's unintentional. So we access our implicit memory when we are using, for example, language, or we're performing motor skills such as riding a bike or playing soccer. So this process is data-driven or bottom-up, and it depends simply on our sensory or motor information. It does not require manipulation by higher level cortical processing. So again, implicit memory is a part of long-term memory. It is non-conscious and it involves skills, habits, priming, and conditioning. So researchers have suggested that the brain circuit for implicit memory includes the entire neocortex and the basal ganglia. The basal ganglia receive projections from all regions of the neocortex, as well as from dopamine cells in the substantia nigra, and then send projections through the globus pallidus and the ventral thalamus to the premotor cortex. So you can see that right here. So the basal ganglia will receive projections from the neocortex and the substantia nigra, and they will send it through the ventral thalamus to the premotor cortex. So the motor cortex also shares connections with the cerebellum, and the cerebellum therefore also contributes to implicit memory. So on the left image, you can see the general anatomical areas that are included in implicit memory, which is of course the basal ganglia, the premotor cortex, the thalamus, amygdala, and substantia nigra, cerebellum. And then on the image on the right, you can see the information flow through the implicit memory circuit. Okay, so as I said, cortical motor regions also perceive projections from the cerebellum through the thalamus. So an example is that the cerebellum plays an important role in a form of non-conscious learning called classical or Pavlovian conditioning. So here, a neutral stimulus is paired with a stimulus that evokes a certain behavior. So let's look at this picture. In this example, a puff of air to the eye is paired with a stimulus, for example, tone. So eventually, normally when you have a puff of air into the eye, you blink, right? So eventually, if you do that often and you hear the tone as well, eventually when the tone is sounded, the conditioned person will blink even though the air puff does not occur, so only when it hears the tone. So the person will non-consciously learn to associate a tone with blinking. He will associate the tone with the air puff and therefore blink. So lesions to pathways from the cerebellum will impair this conditioned response. However, whenever there is a lesion in the cerebellum, it will not stop the original response of the person blinking after the actual air puff happens. So this is the unconditioned response. So this evidence suggests that the cerebellum mediates learning discrete, adaptive, and behavioral responses. Okay, so next up we are going to talk about emotional memory. Emotional memory is also one of the three parts of long-term memory. Emotional memory can be conscious or non-conscious. So emotional memory is a memory for affective properties of stimuli or events. So this could be attraction or avoidance, or it could be fear. So let's talk about fear conditioning. So in fear conditioning, a noxious stimulus is paired with a neutral stimulus to elicit an emotional response. For example, if a rat is placed in a box that has a metal grid floor, and through this metal floor, we can give it a mild shock. So it's very mild, but it's kind of unpleasant. So when the tone is later presented with the shock, eventually the rat will associate the tone with the shock. So when later the tone is presented without the shock, the animal will still be afraid and act that way, and he will freeze. So normally when rats are afraid, they will just freeze and stand still. So the animal tells us that it has a learned response to associate the tone with a shock. So this is kind of similar as the blinking one we saw previously, right? So although both the eye blink we talked about earlier, which is a non-emotional form of conditioning, and this fear conditioning are both Pavlovian learning, different parts of the brain mediate learning in each case. So circuits of the amygdala mediate fear conditioning, and circuits of the cerebellum mediate eye blink conditioning. So emotional memories contain both non-conscious or implicit and conscious aspects, so explicit aspects. So for example, people can react with fear to specific stimuli, but they can also fear situations for which they have no specific memory. So an example of this is panic disorder. In panic disorder, people show high anxiety, but cannot identify the specific cause of this anxiety. Thus, the emotional memory can be seen as separate from explicit and implicit memory. Emotional memory has a unique anatomical component to it, which is the amygdala, as you can see right here and right here. So the amygdala consists of a number of nuclei. You have the basolateral complex, the cortical nucleus, the medial nucleus, and the central nucleus. The basolateral complex can be further subdivided into lateral, the basal, and accessory basal nuclei. And the amygdala connects autonomic systems that control things like blood pressure and heart rate, and it connects to the hypothalamus, which controls our hormones. So this is why when we get excited, our heart can start beating faster, or when we get scared, our heart will start beating faster. So damage to the amygdala gets rid of emotional memory, but it has little effect on implicit or explicit memories. So the amygdala has especially close connections with the medial temporal cortical structures. So it projects the structures taking part in producing autonomic response. So it talks to the hypothalamus, and it also talks to the periaqueductal gray matter. In addition, the amygdala also links to implicit memory system through its connections with the basal ganglia. So as you can see right here, it connects to the hypothalamus and periaqueductal gray matter, but it's also to other systems, connected to other systems through the basal ganglia and the medial temporal cortex. So eventually the information will go to frontal, parietal, temporal, occipital, and cingulate cortices. Okay, so this was a relatively short video. In the next video, we are going to continue talking about memory, and we're going to start off with short-term memory.